So, lectionary this week takes us to Mark, back to Mark. We're in chapter 7. There's a story that's called the Syrophonecian woman. We're actually looking at just part of the lectionary for this week. It's actually part of a longer story, but this is enough that we're going to just focus on that. And it brings up some ideas about how do we interpret really difficult passages that oftentimes are so obvious when we just see them with eyes on their own, but they're so problematic that we're oftentimes told that they mean something completely different, which is the equivalent of essentially being gaslighted by mainstream Christianity, simply because it's really powerful. It's really provocative. It doesn't give us really easy answers, and it threatens a lot of the presumptions about who benefits from Christianity. So let's look at one of them. And the picture is of course evocative. And we know that recent statistics for 2023, for example, show that 3.2 million people were at the southern border of the United States, trying to find a better life, uh, fleeing really, really horrific violence and threats of economic hardship in other parts of the world, and not just in the global south. We know that the populations of people that are crossing the border are very diverse, that they represent lots of nations that you wouldn't suspect, such as countries that are not even part of the American continental system. For example, China, and many Asian countries who find it easier, migrants who find it easier to fly from their home of origin to a country like Panama or Colombia or Mexico, and then try to enter the United States through our southern border. Um, we also know that many people are crossing through other borders as well, including airports and our northern border with Canada. So it isn't only a problem for one part of this country. It isn't really a problem at all, depending on how you look at it. And it's a social situation of people who are different, people who are foreign, who are perceived as being other, who are trying to find what they need for their families, and who oftentimes are willing to take whatever they can get, so that other people that they love very much have a better life. These are the same ideas that happen in this story. Eva, can we go to the next slide? Great. So this is the passage itself. Can someone read it, please?
Mark 7:24-29. Jesus left Gennesaret and went to the territory of Tyre and Sidon. There he went into a certain house and wanted no one to recognize him, but he could not pass unrecognized. A woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him. She approached Jesus and fell at his feet. The woman, who was Greek, a Syrophonecian by birth, begged Jesus to expel the demon from her daughter. He told her, "Let the children of the household satisfy themselves at the table first. It is not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs." She replied, "Yes, Rabbi, but even the dogs under the table eat the family scraps." And then Jesus said to her, "For saying this, you may go home happy. The demon has left your daughter." When she got home, she found her daughter in bed and the demon gone.
Great. And this is from the inclusive translation, which actually is easier for us to read, more in line with our sensibilities, but maybe glosses over some of the really problematic language. And so we'll go over that. But it turns out that this story doesn't show up only in Mark. It's a story that has probably penetrated our imagination as people who have grown up in churches. And so it gets oftentimes gets conflated with the other tellings of the story. So I've included those as well. Let's go to the next slide, just to familiarize ourselves. So where are we talking about? Gennesaret, the where Jesus essentially starts the journey, is on the west side of the Sea of Galilee here, just south of Capernaum. And he goes up to Phoenicia, which is not a short journey. So between the land of Tyre and Sidon. Phoenicia is not unfamiliar to the biblical world. Phoenicia is a very wealthy area. Um, Tyre and Sidon, for example, are cities that are now located in Lebanon that had the only forests, for example, in the ancient Near East. That was significant because that means that they had trees that were sufficient for building, and they had the only carpenters that knew how to work with large pieces of wood. So, for example, when the temple was built, all the carpenters, the decorations come from Tyre and Sidon, because those are the only people that would have knowledge to be able to build large constructions because they had the native wood, the hardwoods. Also, Phoenicia has a different name in many other parts of the Bible. It's also known to us as Philistia. Um, so, if you think about other Philistines that were very famous, you might think of the story about David and Goliath. Um, this is the area that we're talking about. It's foreign, it's not friendly, it's not Jewish. So it worships a different God. It has a problematic political history. It's definitely not a place that Jesus should be. The question of why Jesus goes to Tyre and Sidon is an open question. And that source of ambiguity can be problematic. It's something that we probably should be able to get a better grasp on by the end of this. Okay, let's go on to the next. I just wanted to give us a sense of where. So this is another telling of the same story from the book of Matthew. Does someone else want to read this?
David left there and departed. Jesus left there and departed for the district of Tyre Sidon. It happened that a Canaanite woman living in that area came and cried out to Jesus, "Heir to the house of David, have pity on me. My daughter is horribly demon possessed." Jesus gave her no word of response. The disciples came up and repeatedly said to him, "Please get rid of her. She keeps calling after us." Finally, Jesus turned to the woman and said, "My mission is only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." She then prostrated herself before him with the plea, "Help me, Rabbi." He answered, "But it isn't right to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." "True, Rabbi," she replied, "but even the dogs get to eat the scraps that fall from the table." Jesus then said in reply, "Woman, you have great faith. Your wish will come to pass." At that very moment, her daughter was healed.
Great. So let's point out some significant differences between the two. Um, Not significant necessarily in terms of, oh, this story means one thing and the other one means the other. Matthew is, if we recall other presentations, a later writing, um, we think. So Matthew has definitely got the Mark text in front of them, the writers of Matthew, and they're modifying it to be able to meet their needs. Let's also remember that at this time in history, both when Jesus lived as well as when these stories were being recorded some 70 years, 70, 80 years later, um, this is all part of the Roman Empire. So these are all provinces, clients of the Roman Empire. They're inhabited by people that are subjects of the Roman Empire, people that are competing with each other for favor from the Royal Roman Empire. Um, and so when I say people that are competing with each other, we mean not just Jews and Romans or Jews and Philistines, Jews and Phoenicians. We mean that the many, many, many splintered political and religious groups within what would be called Jews. So would those be the leaders that are in Jerusalem, groups that are called the Essenes or the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the Jesus followers who would become Christians, um, they're all competing with each other for favor. They're all, in many ways, being treating each other very violently as well. Uh, okay, so let's look at what does anyone notice the main difference? Like the really big one.
They defined who Jesus was.
Yeah. It's not highlighted here. I didn't want to make it that
Oh.
obvious. The highlights are for a different reason. It's that the woman is called Canaanite in this case. If you flip back one slide, two slides,
Ah,
Eva. How is she called this time? She's the Syrophonecian woman.
Greek Syrophonecian by birth.
Okay, so Syrophonecian means that she's Philistine. In this case, she's Canaanite. And that's big because Canaanites, the land of Canaan, is not Phoenicia. The land of Canaan is the greater area that is given to Israel, right, in the book of Joshua to be conquered. That's the promised land. These are the people that were supposed to be dispossessed of their land that Israel was supposed to destroy. So she is one of those,
Ah,
right? So that's the big difference in Matthew. We're not going to treat the story as the Mark version or the Matthew version. We're going to treat these both together as one story for tonight's purposes. And I wanted to highlight some things because these are areas where the translation kind of glosses over some other language. Heir to the house of David. This is better translated as Lord, son of David. Um, Lost sheep of the house of Israel. Those are Jews.
mhm.
Rabbi is not actually here the rabbi as a teacher, it's Lord, master. um, and scraps that fall from the table, of course. That's dog imagery, right? So there's a lot of power here. And if we take traditional, like, let's look at a first level interpretation of this. Let's go to the next slide. I mentioned at the beginning only 6 slides, and we're almost already through slide number 5. That's the good news. Here are some interpretations that come from well-meaning, well-educated, very, very thoughtful people. Um, we'll talk about who they are in just a second, but let's read them. Another voice?
Read the left side or the right side?
Just read the left one.
Okay. First steps. It is the story about Jesus as racist that gives me insomnia. The way he can tell this woman with a desperate ill child a dog because that's how he learned it growing up. I want to throw away the orthodoxy about Jesus being human as well as divine. That is wrapped up ugly in the story. This is no Bethlehem, but I can't. I want to ignore or explain so many things, even suggest that he was encouraging her courage, but I can't. Instead, I simply open my hands for the gift. She challenged him. He listened to her, and they walked away healed. Later, and for us, he let Mark tell the story.
Right, and I'll read the next one. This is by Steve Garnis Holmes. These are both pastors. Steve is a Methodist minister who writes a lot of poetry that we oftentimes use in our services. And
Mhm.
Marin is a minister as well. I believe she's United Church of Christ. I think they're both in New Hampshire. So he wrote, "From the slime that's been slung, through the epithet thicket, through the tangle of shouldn't and couldn't and can't, with love and guts and feist, she rises up, not with a desperate plea, but simply knowing more, for the moment than Jesus does of what is possible and what is right. She names the slight, slingshots the slur, paints the gallows, exposes the lie, and claims her human place. And Jesus learns a thing or two about her, about those pagans, about himself, about grace. It's not Jesus who does the miracle, she does. The power is in her faith in herself and her daughter and their place in this house of grace. The healing is in her rising up. And you, sister, what have you been called? What table have you been shoved under? What crumbs are yours that will multiply like loaves and fishes? Name them." These are really wonderful. Hard to criticize, but why not? Let's go back to the text. So let's say that the first level readings about this, rather the zero level readings, the traditional readings, the readings that empower power differences, um, usually look at this and say something like, well, this is about Jesus um, seeing that people beyond Jews also needed healing. This is the beginning of the Great Commission, which is Jesus sending out disciples to all nations to teach them to obey my words. It's about mission. It's about the Gentiles. It's about different people coming to know Christ. That's like the least helpful understanding of this. That's generally the traditional one. If you want to get to liberal, well-meaning Christians like Marin and Steve Barnes, like, sorry, actually, that's really disrespectful. If you want to get to an interpretation that goes one step further, unfortunately exemplified by these two instances of what are otherwise really, really thoughtful, really, really, really helpful ministers, you get to the interpretation that says, honestly, this is racist. Jesus is racist. There's just no way around that. Jesus calls her a dog. It's a curse. It's a slur. It doesn't recognize the humanity of this woman. And maybe it's enough for us tonight just to be able to see that, to acknowledge it, and to sit with that for a while, and to start to understand and acknowledge that there are some problems in the Bible, that Jesus always isn't always the furry, the fluffy, loving character that gets it right every single time and shows us the perfect model of how to be human. Jesus screws up. Um, and if you can, that's where you need to be, that's fine. Maybe that's where these two authors needed to be. And that's where their churches that they're ministering to, maybe that's as far as they could go. So just to be able to go there is enough. And that's where these poems leave us, to recognize that Jesus needed help, and that perhaps one of the traditional readings, or one of the traditional liberal commentaries on this, is that the woman is held up as a model because she is empowered to help Jesus overcome his racism and to get over himself. It has been recognized that that is a traditional reading amongst white liberal Christians. And there's more to do, because the thing that these readings leave out in this passage is looking at power and looking at how this passage has been used and how it's been misused. So when we start to go further and we start to do the work that we call sometimes in this church post-colonial or decolonizing, we looked at voices that are thinking about colonization. These are oftentimes voices from scholars of color who come from countries outside of the United States or the West. So looking at critiques from, for example, Benny Liu or Fernando Segovia or Kwok Pui-lan or Musa Dubé, these are critiques that come from Latin America or from West Africa or from Chinese American immigrants. We see a different way to look at this. So they would notice, looking at this passage, or they would bring some questions to the table. So let's ask those together. Let's also notice some things. Okay, so there are different places here. There's Jerusalem, which is not here in this story particularly, but is in the larger part of this chapter, that Jesus has just argued with Pharisees and scribes who have come from Jerusalem. So they represent the cultural and political center of the area. They represent another subjugated people that are competing with the community of Matthew, which is based in Antioch, which are not Jewish at this point. They're Christians who have been kicked out of Judaism. So they're seen as competitors for Roman favor. The churches here are not contesting Rome. They're not critiquing imperial power. They're trying to curry favor from Rome. In colonial language, we would call them collaborators, or we would call them, well, yeah, that's pretty much what we call them. And they oftentimes tend to reproduce imperial authority to be able to find their place as long as they're not at the bottom of the pile. Both the church in Antioch the community of Matthew as well as the Jewish leaders. So that's one location here. We have the location of Tyre and Sidon, of course. That's Phoenicia. We have a Canaanite woman. And we have Jesus, who is a traveler, who is able to go between different communities and empower people. Jesus is the one that has the most power in this because Jesus can heal. Canaan is doubly screwed. Canaan is an occupied area under Roman rule, and Canaan also has a history of being conquered by Israel in this story. In the story that the Bible tells, that's not completely true, of course, historically. So there is encoded power and disempowerment here. The woman is also disempowered, right? Because she's a woman in this society. This isn't just a story about race. This isn't just a story about gender. Jesus heals other people of other races previous to this in both Matthew and Mark. Jesus heals, for example, the generess demoniac, who is not Jewish. Jesus heals women. Jesus heals Jairus's daughter. Jesus heals the woman with a hemorrhage. Jesus heals Simon's mother-in-law, I think. Mother-in-law? Mother-in-law. So the problem that Jesus has here, Jesus' reluctance, is not easily explained by just race, by just gender. It's something about either gender and race together in Mark, or when we take the story as a whole, gender, race, and foreignness, but foreignness as a colonial subject, right? As a member of a people that have been conquered. These are the things that are at play in this story. Let's talk about, we asked the question about why this isn't, remember, we're reading a text, right? We're not reading a history. We're not watching a documentary with primary material. We're not asking the question, why doesn't the woman stand up for herself? We're asking questions more like, why does the author portray the woman as not standing up for herself? There's always the question of not just what do these characters do, but why is it of benefit to the author to tell the story in this certain way? So we're going to ask the question of, why does the woman not challenge Jesus directly and say something like, I'm not a dog. I've got a daughter that has a need. I deserve this. Or why are you treating me this way? Why is it useful for the author to portray her this way? What is the larger narrative that this is serving? Who is recognized as having power? Who does this give more power to? Or what does this, what part of, what sort of story does this tell? One way to talk about this would be that it tells the story about Jesus's authority, divine authority, that kind of replicates imperial authority in the book of in the book of Mark specifically. And that's pretty problematic, right? Because it claims a divine right to tell people exactly who they are. Let's notice that in this story, there are three sets of people. There's Jesus, there's the woman, and there's a third set, right? Because someone had to hear this. Jesus is not writing this down himself. The woman is not writing this down. This is written down. This is supposedly documented by a silent narrator who is, in both the Mark and the Matthew, assumed to be from the class of observers here that are the disciples. So they're present in the fact that this story even got recorded. But there's something, another group to be remembered. And what kind of roles do these three groups of characters represent? Well, there's a foreign victim, and there are imperializing characters who write the story, and this goes back to our previous question, to justify a concept of superiority here. There's a story in imperial narratives, in colonizing narratives, that's reproduced over and over and over again. It's a story of a land grab. It's the story of Moses. It's the story of Joshua. Much of the history, what we call the deuterocanonical or history of the Old Testament. There's a story in Pocahontas and John Smith, right? It is a foreign person that needs help and invader that is happy to provide it. It's the story of Aeneas and Queen Dido in Virgil's Aeneid. It's an old universal human story, and it happens here too. Let's ask questions. Does Jesus really change here? So the two poems that we read, which are really, really kind of nice poems if they were true, says that this woman changes Jesus. Um, Surely what we know from the story is that the woman's daughter is healed. So maybe Jesus's mind about whether he was going to heal this daughter changes. But does Jesus's attitude toward this woman change? Does he treat her with greater humanity? Does he recognize her as being a person worthy of dignity? And what do you think?
No.
Yeah. Isn't that kind of shitty?
Yes.
We want it to be true, but it's not. What I see in this story is a woman who wants so badly for someone she loves, wants something so badly that she's willing to take or to do whatever it takes, accept whatever role she's given to be able to achieve her ends. If that means taking the role of a dog, taking the identity of a dog, taking the identity as someone who is not equal, she'll do it. Going back, I mean, it's a, doesn't take much to guess why the opening image on our cover slide was used. It's a story that we still see here today of how many of us in our own families see stories in our as immigrants of first generations who are willing to take jobs that are beneath them or to take positions in society that are pretty demeaning because they hope that their kids have something better one day. Um, and they don't demand to be treated equally. They don't demand to be paid fairly. They don't demand to be able to be given equal labor rights because that's just not the way the world works. And Jesus isn't fighting that, is the problem here. So, how we could talk about the story when we see this with eyes that see power is that this is a woman who is a foreigner in a story that she did not write. She's a victim being talked about by people who do have power. And in that story that they're telling about her, she takes on the role of parroting the superiority of her subjugators, betraying her own people and her own land. She does not stand up for them so that she can survive, so that her family can survive. She takes on what might be called a colonized mind. She becomes a domesticated subject. The question comes back, why doesn't she stand up for herself? And that's the kind of question that comes from people that have never really been in a position of not having power. Anyone who really knows exactly why she didn't stand up for herself, because that wouldn't have gotten her what she needed most, which was not dignity. It was something much more tangible, something much more immediate. Her daughter needed healing,
Mhm.
and dignity just wasn't worth it compared to the health and safety of her family, of her daughter. Why doesn't Jesus seem to care about that? Is the question. That's not really the question, though, right? Because again, when we talk about texts, this is not a documentary. This is not a portrayal of what Jesus actually said. It's a portrayal of a story that's told about Jesus. So why didn't the authors of Mark and Matthew portray Jesus as caring? It's probably because they didn't care very much either. Not easy to talk about this, but it's not a surprise that Christianity has been historically so easily used to justify colonization because so many of the texts come from empire. it's possible to both be a resistor and to have a colonized mindset, to be a collaborator at the same time. It's never so easy or black and white in these really horrific power structures that are imposed on foreign people, in which to survive, you oftentimes have to play the game to some degree. So to understand our religion of Christianity, when we call ourselves Christians, is to understand that this was a religion that was born in an imperial power structure where people had to play a role to survive. And these texts aren't pure. They aren't all good. They aren't all bad either. But when we treat them that way later on as a holy Bible, we get caught up in that same power struggle. So our task is to be a little bit smarter than that, to see how these texts reproduce imperial structures and to be able to be smart enough to not do the same thing. When we don't do that, then we look at this text and we say stupid things like talking about illegals, aliens at the border, right? Which isn't so much worse or better than calling a person a dog. It's dehumanizing language that doesn't see someone as equal. If it's uncomfortable to talk about the politics of this in any real political sense, which, this means if it's uncomfortable to love people, let's talk about this in religious terms. Let's talk about this as a story about mission, about outreach to people that are non-Christians, because the portrayal of a Greek, the portrayal of a Canaanite, is inherently also talking about someone not just of a foreign status as an ethnicity, someone as being a gendered status as a woman, but also having a different religious status. Let's talk about how Christianity treats people that are not Christians. The question here, I think, is one of, is there equality in mission, or is there the requirement that mission accepts people as being unequal? So if you aren't also a Christian, are you somehow always going to be less than? And does mission afford people the status as being equally dignified, worthy of equal dignity? Or when mission is based on passages like this, does it encode in itself inherently, always inherently, some concept of other people as taking a secondary status? Uh, that's an important question for us to ask. Uh, what doesn't happen here is that the woman is healed because she deserves healing based solely on her status as a human being, right? She's given healing because she promises to not eat the crumbs, rather, to eat only the crumbs, not to eat the bread off the table that belongs to the children, here, the children of Israel being Jews. So, by promising to accept a permanently unequal status, this is what guarantees her the right to healing. How many times do you think that we reproduce this in our churches, in our understanding of Christianity, that we extend to people some limited level of acceptance as long as they promise, or as long as we feel safe that they will never ask to be treated equally to people who perceive themselves to be on the inside? We do this with our immigration policy. We do this in our churches as well. Instead, what if we did things a different way? Um, what if this isn't a story about justifying mission to Gentiles? What if this isn't divine salvation history? What if this isn't about acknowledging Davidic kingship? What if this isn't about gender, empire, and mission? Um, what could this be about? It's certainly about otherness. It's certainly about power relationships. Remember, I said that there were three groups of people here. There's a woman, there's Jesus, and there are the disciples. What if the reason that Jesus is so reluctant to heal is because this is a test for the disciples to see whether they'll step in? They remain silent, they fail, if that's the case. What if this is an invitation for us to look at the situation and to acknowledge that something is wrong? What if this is a story about otherness without inequality? What if this is the woman that's saying, I'm one of the children. I have a right to this as well. And others, they have a right to this as well, too. What if she doesn't take on the role of being the dog? Is there room for that interpretation as well? That's an interpretation that we might see from people who see themselves as being the dogs of colonization, people that come from the global south. Um, Perhaps that's a way that we can read this differently. Um, Perhaps this isn't a case of just pure physical healing, right? This is a case of, as the Mark story shows, a daughter who is demon possessed. That's kind of problematic, right? Because that means that the foreigner in this case is not just in need of healing, the foreigner is evil. And so this is the type of story when we tell it that way that justifies why we go to foreign places to save people, because foreigners need subjugation, they need healing. In fact, they beg for it. Dogs are unworthy, inhuman. What if mission is not about unequal inclusion? What if our story here is to recognize that when we do this, that that we keep people permanently under the table? And is there another way? Uh, I don't think that this story gives us a model per se. It gives us a question. And maybe sometimes that's as valuable because it unsettles our certainty, it unsettles our security, keeps us humble, but it gives us a sense of what to do next, which is to take this question as being the way that we should be in the world, to see power structures, to see things that aren't right, and to continue to question them. That's sometimes the most challenging thing that Christianity can task us to do, but also the most liberating thing that we can do, which is to always be the source of questions, to be the source of disturbance of power structures. If there's anything that I can give you from this lesson, it's that. Um, that sense of being reading this with eyes that are open and feeling really essentially uncomfortable about this, and then taking that discomfort and seeing where else we're uncomfortable for similar reasons, and then asking what should we do about that. That's my takeaway for this, and I hope it's not too dark. Um, and again, of course, if you need to be at the place just to see this as being helpful to recognize that the Bible isn't always a model of behavior, fine. That's a great place to be. And if you can take it one step farther, it's to say, great, so then what do we do about that? And that's where I'd prefer us to be. But this is a good short example of how do we take our instincts um, about what's wrong in this world, our own family narratives about being the descendants of immigrants, and knowing that this is a true story for our families as well, not one that we want to perpetuate, and seeing that when we don't pay attention to this, when we don't see power in a story, it gets really dangerous, and to take all of that really seriously. That's sort of what I've got.